So here's the deal with 22. The conclusion is at the very end. Do we all identify that as the conclusion? Mm-hmm. Each of these species has adapted genetically to its distinct habitat. We do know that the species are genetically different, right? And if they're genetically different, does that necessarily mean that they have adapted to the distinct habitat?
No.
Could they have become genetically different for some other reason?
Yeah, like mating with a local salmon.
Yep, like mating with a local salmon. Don't worry about what's going to come next. Taryn, are you cool with that?
Mm-hmm.
This is basically sort of a causal argument, right? Saying why they became genetically distinct. And that's certainly a possibility that they adapted to their environment, but maybe something else happened. Answer choice A, neither of the two populations of sockeyes has interbred with the native salmon. If that's true, then it's more likely, does not prove the conclusion, but it's more likely that they became genetically distinct by adapting to their environment rather than by interbreeding with another species.
Wait, by or because they didn't interbreed, by genetic isolation or their environmental factors?
Well, so the conclusion is each has adapted genetically to its distinct habitat. If they became genetically different by adapting, then the conclusion would make sense.
Right.
If they became genetically different by interbreeding with another species, or one of them interbred with the original species, then it's less likely that they would be genetically adapted to their distinct habitat. They would just be genetically different because they interbred. Right.
Okay.
So answer choice A gets rid of an alternative explanation for how they became genetically different, and thus strengthens the original conclusion. Does not prove it by any means. What answers do we choose? C. Well, what? C? B? Okay, B. When the native salmon in Lake Clearwater were numerous, they comprised two distinct populations that did not interbreed. Okay, so in the past... Wait. They comprised two distinct populations that did not interbreed. That's exactly what's happening now. We have two distinct populations that are not interbreeding. That doesn't say, though, how they became genetically distinct. Right? All it says is, before we had two distinct species, genetically different species, and they did not interbreed. Now we have two genetically different species, and they do not interbreed. Great, but how did they get to the point where they are genetically different?
Wait, they just say two distinct populations.
It says they do not interbreed in the passage. They split into two distinct populations that do not interbreed. So that's true now too. So basically answer choice B is saying what's happening now is similar to what happened before, but it doesn't say anything as to how they became distinct or whether they became how their genes became different.
Mm-hmm.
Nick, are you okay with that?
Yeah, I think I missed something here in the original argument
Okay.
about, I'll have to think about it more.
All right. Answer choice C. Most types of salmon that inhabit lakes spend part of the time in shallow water and part of the time in deeper water. Cool, but how did they become genetically different? This is something kind of we already know. They are spending times in different parts of the lake, but how did they become genetically different? That will tell us a lot about how they are genetically different and whether they are adapted to their environment or whether they're just genetically different.
Wrong answers in strengthened questions usually are frequently restating a premise. Is that right?
Yeah, if you restate a premise, you're not helping in any way,
Right.
shape, or form.
Yeah, and I think I liked it because I saw, like they've been adapted to distinct habitats. Here we go, talking about distinct habitats, and I got rid of A immediately.
No, it's
because I was
technically
like,
not.
native populations, native salmon.
It's not restating a premise because it's adding some new information, talking about most salmon in general, not just these two. But that really doesn't help us at all either because it's like we really just care about these two anyway. So it's adding information that's not useful. It doesn't change our opinion about these two, which is all we really care about.
The conclusion.
Do have the same effect as restating a premise.
Has the same effect as restating a premise because the only thing we can glean from this would be about those two, and we already know about those two.
Right, I guess. Okay, so if you have one species that goes in the deep areas and one that goes in the shallow areas, right?
Yeah.
Like the idea that they had this parent, this ancestor that was in both, that doesn't at all support the idea that like in the ancestral salmon or the typical type of salmon, they're in multiple habitats, but like we can conclude that these are genetically distinct and different types because they are in different habitats, as opposed to like typical salmon, which are in both types of habitats.
I mean, one thing is we don't have to conclude that they're distinct because they just said that up front as a premise.
Yeah.
It said, after being introduced, this genetically uniform group of sockeye is split into two distinct populations that do not interbreed.
Mm-hmm.
I guess actually, oh no, it says, since the two populations are now genetically different, right? They differ genetically. Some researchers have hypothesized that each adapted genetically to its distinct habitat. So we
Mhm.
know for a fact that they're different. We
Yeah.
just don't know how they're different.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Do we feel good about this one?
Yeah.
We see how A gets rid of an alternative explanation? Okay.
In a supported question, restating a premise would be an attractive answer, right?
Oh, yes. In an inference question,
Yeah.
right? Like, which one following must be true given what was said or is most strongly supported by what was said? Absolutely. Because you're like, yeah, that's got to be true.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's good in those questions, but not good here.
Mm-hmm.